In 1922, groups tied to Adolf Hitler burned the most singular building an architect had produced that century. In 1935, the Third Reich, the Nazi regime that had turned Germany into a machine of total obedience and terror, where a single party controlled what you read, what you taught, and what you were allowed to believe, formally banned the society this man had built. In 1936, his books were added to the government's list of forbidden works. And in 1941, the last of his schools in Germany was forced to shut its doors. Today, more than 1 billion people live, eat, learn, and heal according to principles this man created. They burned everything, and he never flinched. This is the story of Rudolf Steiner, and of the knowledge that the established order tried to erase from the face of the earth. To understand how a man reaches that point, hunted by a regime that burned books and shuttered schools, and still leaves behind a legacy that runs through an entire century, you have to go back to the moment when everything started to collapse. Not his birth, not his first ideas. The moment when his enemies decided that words and threatening posters were no longer enough. It was just past midnight, January 1st, 1923. Outside, snow. The kind of silence that only exists in the Swiss winter, when even the wind seems to have gone to sleep. The village of Dornach was still, but on the hill above the village, something was wrong. The flames were visible from a distance when the first residents opened their windows. An intense orange tearing through the dark sky, reflections dancing across the window panes of the houses below. And at the center of that glow, a building that existed nowhere else in the world was dying. Let me try to describe that building in 30 seconds. Picture a structure made entirely of wood, with 2 enormous domes that merged as if they had grown from each other. No right angles, no repeated forms. Each interior column hand-carved into a shape different from all the others, as if each one were a living thing. The stained glass windows carved at varying thicknesses so that light wasn't merely passing through them. It was being transformed as it crossed the glass. A building that took 10 years to construct by volunteers from 14 countries who worked side by side through a world war without killing each other, even as their respective nations were doing exactly that just over the mountains. That building was burning. Firefighters arrived. Members of the society who lived nearby ran up the hill, some still in their pajamas. They tried to save what they could: books, sculptures, documents, the enormous painted panels from the interior walls. A man named Jacob Ott, a watchmaker from the village who had helped build the structure with his own hands for years, walked into the fire trying to save something he considered irreplaceable. He never came back out. When the sun rose over Dornach on the first day of 1923, the most original work of architecture produced that century was ash and charred timber. The man who had designed all of it was woken in the middle of the night. He spent the rest of it watching the flames from the window of his nearby home. When morning came, he walked down to the still smoldering ruins, found the members of the society gathered there in silence, some crying, many beyond words, and said something none of them ever forgot. Whatever the event may be, I assure you I will never be deflected from my path. Not resignation, defiance. His name was Rudolf Steiner, and the fire that destroyed the Goetheanum, as that building was known, was not an accident. Police investigators at the time pointed to arson as the most probable cause. No suspect was ever formally charged. But Steiner knew exactly who had motive, because in the months before, groups that would soon have a name the entire world would learn to fear had attempted to physically attack him during a lecture in Munich. And in the months following the destruction of the Goetheanum, the man whose name appeared on War Against Steiner posters all over Bavaria, a frustrated Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler, would attempt a coup inside a beer hall. But that's the middle of the story. What matters first is who Rudolf Steiner was, where he came from, and exactly what he had done to earn that much hatred from that many directions at once. Because his story isn't simply the story of a persecuted philosopher. It's the story of someone who had the audacity to propose that human beings are capable of far more than any system of power prefers them to believe. That the human mind has windows onto the world that official science refuses to acknowledge. That freedom isn't a political concession, it's the fundamental nature of who you are. And that this nature can be developed, trained, expanded by anyone, regardless of race, nation, class, or religious background. He paid a steep price for that. If you're here at the Unseen Key for the first time, this channel exists to tell the stories that official history prefers to leave at the margins. Stories of people who discovered, built, or said something too threatening to establish power, and who paid for it in ways that rarely make it into textbooks. If this story is going to mean something to you, hit like now and subscribe if you haven't already. Not as a favor, as a statement that this kind of story matters. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Rudolf Steiner was born on February 27, 1861, in a small town called Donji Kraljevic. Today it's in Croatia. At the time, it was a railway station in the interior of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Rudolf's father was the station's telegraph operator. Pay attention to that detail, the telegraph operator father, because it says a lot about who Rudolf would become. Johann Steiner wasn't rich, powerful, or well-connected. He was a mid-level employee of a railroad company who moved wherever the tracks required. But he was a man who believed in education and free thinking, and who saw absolutely no reason why his brilliant son should go into the church, the standard destiny for smart boys born poor in 19th century Central Europe. His father wanted him to be an engineer. The son had bigger plans, though he didn't know it yet. The family moved frequently. Rudolf grew up in alpine villages, among mountains and snow, and developed two things that rarely exist together in a child: a gift for exact science and a very particular sensitivity to what he described, carefully and without drama, as a deeper layer of reality. He noticed things, not ghosts, not dramatic visions, more like an awareness that the visible world had an interior dimension that most people simply didn't register, the way someone hears a frequency that others can't detect. He never talked about it. He held it, observed it, tried to understand it with the same seriousness he brought to mathematics. And it was in mathematics that the young Rudolf found something that fascinated him for reasons that went beyond numbers. At 8 years old, he picked up a book on geometry and lost himself in it for days. Not because he was a computational prodigy, but because geometry revealed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was possible to know things with absolute certainty using thought alone. Without touching, without measuring, without leaving your chair. Just thinking. The triangle he drew on paper and the triangle that existed in his mind were the same thing. And that identity between thought and Reality seemed to point towards something fundamental about the nature of the human mind that the adults around him didn't seem to find particularly remarkable. In 1879, the family moved to Inzersdorf, near Vienna, and Rudolf entered the Institute of Technology, today the Vienna University of Technology, on a scholarship. He studied physics, chemistry, botany, mathematics. But in his free time, without anyone asking or expecting it, he devoured philosophy, Kant, Fichte, Schelling, and German literature. To pay his bills, he tutored classmates in math and science. He was the kind of student teachers don't know quite where to put. Too rigorous for the mystical philosophers, too curious for the purely technical scientists. It was inside the institute that the first great intellectual encounter of his life happened. Not with a person and with a book, or rather, with a pile of texts that most specialists preferred to ignore, Goethe's scientific writings. Most people know Goethe from Faust, from the sorrows of young Werther, from the poetry. Very few know that Goethe spent decades developing a scientific methodology fundamentally different from Newton's. While Newton decomposed light into measurable wavelengths and treated the observer as irrelevant to the experiment, Goethe insisted that separating the observer from the phenomenon distorted the phenomenon itself. His theory of color, which the Newtonian establishment had long dismissed, proposed that the human experience of color wasn't a secondary subjective effect of objective physical waves. It was a constitutive part of the phenomenon of color itself. It was a science of the whole, not of isolable parts. And in Steiner's time, most academics considered Goethe's scientific writings a mildly embarrassing footnote to a great poet's career. For Rudolf Steiner, they were the key to everything. Because if Goethe was right, if the human observer is an active participant in knowledge, and not merely an instrument recording external data, then the science that claimed objectivity by systematically excluding inner human experience was actually impoverishing the very reality it claimed to study, and the dimensions of existence that science had declared non-existent simply because its instruments couldn't measure them, might in fact be the most fundamental ones of all. In 1882, at 21, with no publications and no academic credentials yet, he received an unlikely invitation. One of his professors, a Goethe specialist named Carl Julius Schröer, recommended him for a job, editing Goethe's scientific writings for a new German literature series. The editor, Joseph Kirschner, needed someone willing to take those texts seriously, and there weren't many. Rudolf accepted before he finished his studies. He dove into the manuscripts with an intensity that impressed even the skeptics. And what he found in those pages would be the seed of everything he would build across the decades that followed. But what he found in those manuscripts wasn't just philosophy. It was the seed of an idea that, decades later, would put him in the crosshairs of men willing to use violence to silence him. And it all started with a book nobody wanted to read. In 1888, the Goethe archives in Weimar invited Steiner to work on the definitive edition of the poet's complete works. He was 27, from a family with no name and no money, and he was being called to one of the most respected cultural institutions in Europe. Weimar was unlike anywhere he'd been. Artists, musicians, philosophers, and writers whose names filled the books moved through its salons. Steiner arrived, worked in the archives, edited Schopenhauer, wrote philosophical articles, and there, while consulting Goethean manuscripts during the day, He wrote at night the book he would consider the most important of his entire life, The Philosophy of Freedom, published in 1894. But before I tell you what that book proposed, I need to ask you something. How many senses do you have? 5, probably. That's what you were taught. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. Since elementary school, humans have 5 senses. It's a fact, like 2 + 2 is 4. But Rudolf Steiner asked a question that sounds simple and isn't. Where exactly does that list end? Think about it. With your eyes closed, you can tell whether your arm is raised or lowered. That's not sight. That's not touch in the conventional sense. It's a perception of your own body's position and movement in space, what anatomists call proprioception. You can tell you're getting sick before you take your temperature, a diffuse awareness that something in your body isn't working normally. You can hear what someone isn't saying during a conversation, sensing the intention behind the words, and that perception is often more accurate than a rational analysis of the words themselves. And you can recognize, looking into another person's eyes, that there is an interior being there, an individuality, a self, not just a face with muscles and skin. None of those perceptions are explained by the standard 5 senses, and none of them are illusions. Steiner argued that human beings have 12 senses, not 5. The 5 everyone knows, plus 7 that conventional science had systematically discarded because they didn't fit the mechanistic model of the 19th century. The sense of balance, the constant awareness of the body's relationship to gravity, the sense of movement, the consciousness of your own motions without needing to look at them, the sense of life, that internal read of your organism's overall state, the one that warns you something is wrong before any clear symptom appears, the sense of warmth, not just objective temperature, but the lived quality of warmth as experience. The sense of speech, the perception of articulated sound as a carrier of meaning, distinct from the raw physical perception of sound. The sense of another's thought, the capacity to perceive the logical structure and intention behind another person's thinking, and the sense of another's self, perhaps the most radical of all, the direct perception that there is a real individuality inside each person we encounter. Not merely a biological organism we infer must have an inner life. Why does this matter? Because the question of how many senses a human being has is not just anatomical, it's philosophical, and it's political. If you have only 5 senses, and those 5 senses only capture the measurable material world, then everything outside that spectrum, the perception of your organism's interior life, the perception of another's thought, the perception of a spiritual reality, doesn't exist. It's illusion, superstition, pathology, and the human being is, at bottom, a sophisticated biological machine in a universe of matter with no intrinsic meaning. But if you have 12 senses, and 7 of them have been systematically ignored by the science that should have been studying them, then the map you use to understand reality has 7 blank territories. And in those blank territories live some of the most fundamental experiences of human life, the recognition of another person as an interior being, the perception of your own body as a living organism, the ability to know things through direct experience that external instruments can never reach. That was exactly what the philosophy of freedom tried to articulate in 1894. Not the 12 senses. That framework would come later, in lectures during the early 1900s. But the core idea they express, that human beings possess cognitive capacities that official science had decided didn't exist, and that developing those capacities was the path to a freedom that didn't depend on any external authority to grant it. The book's reception was, in Steiner's own words, disappointing. The major German philosophical journals barely mentioned it. It was too rigorous for the mystics, too spiritual for the academic philosophers, too accessible for the specialists. It fell through the cracks between every recognized genre. Steiner left Weimar in 1897. He went to Berlin, bought into an avant-garde literary magazine, plunged into the turbulent intellectual life of the capital, met socialists, anarchists, avant-garde artists, defended Emile Zola during the Dreyfus affair when it was unpopular to do so, lost conservative subscribers, lost liberal subscribers, eventually lost the magazine. He was approaching 40. He had written the most important book of his life, and nobody had really read it. And then, in the summer of 1899, he published an article about an obscure Goethe fairy tale, The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily, and suggested, carefully but without concealing it, that the story carried a spiritual and initiatory meaning that conventional literary reading could never reach. It was the most important article he'd ever written, not for the philosophy, for what happened next, because what happened next put Rudolf Steiner on a path with no return, onto a stage where the consequences of thinking differently wouldn't just be academic. The article reached a Viennese aristocratic couple, Count and Countess Brockdorff. They were part of a movement growing quietly across Europe and North America since the 1870s. The Theosophical Society, founded in New York by a Russian woman named Helena Blavatsky. The Brockdorffs invited Steiner to speak at their weekly gatherings in Berlin. When he stepped up to the podium in that Berlin room in 1899, he said out loud in public, for the first time in his life, what he had kept to himself since childhood, that a spiritual reality existed that could be investigated with the same rigor with which science investigates the physical world. That the great spiritual traditions of humanity weren't superstitions to be overcome. They were attempts, in imperfect languages, to describe something real, and that it was possible to develop interior faculties, precisely those senses that official science had declared non-existent, in a way that allowed a person to perceive that reality objectively, verifiably personally. The room went quiet and came back the next week, and the week after that. Within a few years, Rudolf Steiner was the most intellectually compelling voice in Berlin's spiritual circles. In 1902, he was invited to lead the new German section of the Theosophical Society. He accepted with one condition he never concealed. He would teach from his own perspective, rooted in European philosophy and spiritual tradition, and would not adopt theosophical doctrine as final truth. Some found that arrogant. He didn't change his position. For 11 years, the German section grew under his leadership. He lectured across Europe, Berlin, Munich, Stuttgart, Hamburg, Cologne, Vienna, Prague. He published books that the editorial world didn't quite know how to classify. Knowledge of the Higher Worlds and How to Attain It, published in 1904, was not a collection of beliefs to accept on faith. It was a manual of method, a sequence of attention and meditation practices that anyone could follow, regardless of prior religion, verifying the results through their own experience. Follow the instructions. Observe what happens. Judge for yourself. It was the opposite of dogma, the opposite of authority. And for exactly that reason, it was irresistible to an entire generation of Europeans, intellectually unsatisfied with the two dominant options, the religion that demanded blind faith and the science that declared the universe meaningless. But in 1913, the relationship with theosophy reached a breaking point. The Society's world president, Annie Besant, a remarkable Englishwoman who had moved from socialist activism to esotericism with equal intensity, had discovered a 14-year-old Indian boy named Jiddu Krishnamurti on a beach in Madras and proclaimed him the reincarnation of Christ, the new avatar of humanity for the approaching age. Steiner disagreed, clearly and without excessive diplomacy. For him, the event of Golgotha, the death and resurrection of Christ, held a unique character in the cosmic history of humanity that was not repeated in later incarnations. It was a deep theological and philosophical difference, not a matter of personal preference. When Besant insisted on linking the cult surrounding young Krishnamurti to the Theosophical Society as a whole, Steiner called a meeting in Cologne. In September 1913, he led 55 of the 65 German Theosophical chapters out of the society and founded the Anthroposophical Society as a completely independent entity. It was a clean break. It was also a declaration of independence with immediate consequences. The Anthroposophical Society grew quickly and grew in all the wrong directions from the standpoint of anyone who needed clear categories to control what people thought. It wasn't a religion because it didn't demand faith. It wasn't a philosophical school because it included concrete spiritual practices. It wasn't a political movement because it refused to be captured by any ideology from any direction. It was all three at once, filtered through an intellectual rigor that disarmed those expecting charlatanism and a spiritual depth that disarmed those expecting cold materialism. The Catholic Church and the established Protestant churches saw something unsettling. A system of spiritual development that needed no priests, no sacraments, no institutional intermediaries between the individual and the experience of the sacred. The scientific establishment saw a rival that used its language of rigor and method, but reached conclusions its paradigms couldn't accommodate. And the nationalist movement rising from the ruins of post-war Germany saw something even more threatening. A philosophy that stated, plainly and explicitly, that the essence of a human being transcends any race, any nation, any inheritance of blood. Three enemies, all at once. And instead of retreating, Steiner did something nobody expected, something that would make it impossible to ignore him, for better and for worse. In September 1913, on a hillside above the village of Dornach, near Basel, Switzerland, Rudolf Steiner laid the cornerstone of the Goetheanum, a tribute to the thinker who had shaped his intellectual path since his 20s. The building would serve as headquarters for the new society, a theater for his plays and for the art form of movement he had invented, eurythmy, and a kind of spiritual university where all the disciplines would meet. Construction began immediately, and here is the detail that says more about Steiner and what he represented than any philosophical definition. When World War I exploded in August 1914 and all of Europe turned into a battlefield, work in Dornach continued. And the volunteers doing that work, adults who had left jobs, families, countries to come build something they believed in, were German, English, French, Russian, Austrian, Belgian. Citizens of nations that were, at that exact moment, slaughtering each other just over the mountains. From the top of the Dornach site on clear nights, you could hear the sound of artillery beyond the peaks. And the volunteers kept carving wood side by side. No conflict, no hostility. No, but he's the enemy. 6 years of manual labor, documented with a dedication the archives describe as extraordinary. People arriving with no experience in carpentry or sculpture and learning on the site. Guided by drawings, Steiner produced continuously, every detail conceived by him personally. The interior columns were carved from 7 different types of wood: oak, elm, cherry, ash, maple, birch, pine, each with a unique form expressing the specific character of that tree species. It was an architecture that treated nature as language, not as raw material. The building was formally inaugurated in 1920, and it immediately became a cultural hub unlike anything in Central Europe, a place hosting theater premieres, scientific lectures, medical conferences, eurythmy classes, philosophical debates. In 1919, before the formal inauguration, the Goetheanum had staged the first complete performance of Goethe's Faust the world had ever seen. That same year, 1919, in Stuttgart, Rudolf Steiner founded his first school. The invitation came from Emil Molt, owner of a cigarette factory, the Waldorf Astoria. Molt had attended a Steiner lecture for his factory workers on social reform and human development, and was struck by something specific. Steiner talked about education not as the transfer of content to children who would eventually serve the economy, but as the development of the complete human being, intellectual, artistic, moral, physical, at each stage of growth. Molt proposed, "Would you create a school for my workers' children?" Steiner said yes, with 4 conditions that made the school a radical anomaly by the standards of the time. First, open to everyone, regardless of social background or ability to pay. Second, run cooperatively by the teachers, with no external bureaucratic hierarchy imposing a curriculum. Third, no separation between what was considered intellectual and what was considered practical. Mathematics and woodworking carried equal formative weight. Fourth, minimal interference from the state or from economic interests in what happened inside the classroom. The school opened on September 7, 1919, 256 students. 191 were children of the cigarette factory workers. The other 65 were children of intellectual and artistic families in Stuttgart who had heard about the experiment. It was probably the only school in Germany at that moment where working-class children and upper-middle-class children learned in the same room, with the same teachers, treated with the same respect. The curriculum was unlike anything that existed. The children didn't just read and calculate. They painted, sculpted, performed theater, learned eurythmy, tended gardens, picked up 2 foreign languages from early on. Formal reading and writing were introduced later than in conventional schools, not because they were less important, but because Steiner argued that forcing symbolic abstraction before a child has sufficient bodily and sensory experience of the concrete world produces intellectuals disconnected from the reality they're supposed to understand. The teacher stayed with the same class for several years, developing a deep knowledge of each child as an individual, rather than being replaced annually by subject specialists. Assessment wasn't by numerical grade. It was by continuous observation of each child's development as a person. Steiner visited the school more than 70 times between 1919 and 1924, not to inspect, to talk with teachers, answer hard questions, refine the method through dialogue. It was a living pedagogical experiment, not a fixed curriculum to be obeyed. And it was convincing enough that the idea spread. Within a few years, Waldorf schools had opened in Switzerland, England, the Netherlands, Hungary, and Norway. Not because Steiner franchised or centrally controlled them, but because the principles worked in very different contexts. And the teachers who learned from him went home to their cities and tried to replicate what they'd seen. But while the schools were growing, while the Goetheanum was becoming a living cultural center, while doctors and farmers and artists sought out Steiner from across Europe, something else was growing in the shadows. And this time it wasn't intellectual curiosity. In 1919, a man named Dietrich Eckart published a pamphlet attacking Rudolf Steiner. He called him a Jew. He called him an agent of the international Jewish conspiracy. Eckart was a third-rate poet, a habitual drunk, and a co-founder of a political group in Munich that would soon rename itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party. He was also the political mentor of an unemployed Austrian corporal who attended the same tavern meetings, and who, 2 years later, would write about Steiner in a newspaper called the Völkischen Beobachter, the future official paper of Nazism. That corporal's name was Adolf Hitler. Steiner wasn't Jewish, but that didn't matter to anyone who needed a useful enemy to fit a narrative. What mattered was that Steiner was proposing in lectures that filled halls across Germany something the emerging nationalists found explosive. In the social and economic chaos of post-war Germany, hyperinflation, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, mass unemployment. He was arguing that the answer wasn't a Führer, wasn't racial purity, wasn't a return to some imagined imperial greatness. It was a deep and peaceful reorganization of society into 3 independent spheres: cultural and spiritual life, free from interference by the state or the market; political life based on genuine equality among citizens; and economic life organized by free associations based on real need rather than the accumulation of power. He called it the threefold social order, and it was, for any project of centralized total power, a structural threat, not because it was violent, but because it was intellectually coherent enough to persuade people who might otherwise have been recruited by the politics of hatred. By 1921, things escalated. Steiner had publicly supported a provisional independence solution for Upper Silesia, territory disputed between Germany and Poland after Versailles. The Frankfurter Zeitung published accusations that he was a traitor to Germany. Nationalist groups across central Germany organized systematic disruptions of his lectures. Posters went up on poles in Munich, explicitly calling for what they described as war against Steiner. Think about what that means. You're not a politician. You have no party, no militia, no weapon. You're a 60-year-old philosopher who gives lectures on spiritual development and social reform. And there are posters on the street with your name calling for war. In May of 1922, Steiner went to give a lecture in Munich. The auditorium was full. It was the kind of ordinary evening he'd had hundreds of times. A new city, a paying audience, people who had come to listen. What happened in that hall is documented in police reports from the time. And it's worth understanding what documented in police reports means in this context. It means it was serious enough that law enforcement formally recorded it. While Steiner was speaking, the smell arrived first. Stink bombs thrown from multiple points in the auditorium simultaneously. The kind of coordination that doesn't happen by accident. It requires planning. It requires people positioned strategically throughout the room, waiting for a shared signal. Then the lights. Someone at an electrical control point in the building cut everything at once. The auditorium went completely dark. Hundreds of people inside, the suffocating smell of the bombs, and the chaos that inevitably sets in when a crowd loses visibility all at once. And in the dark, men moved toward the stage. The event organizers were already positioned. They had been warned something might happen, because this wasn't the first disruption, only the most violent. They reached Steiner before the men did and got him out through a back exit. He left the building while the chaos was still unfolding inside. Think about what that means for a moment. A 61-year-old philosopher being rushed out an emergency exit from a lecture he had given hundreds of times across Europe, with never a need for an escort. After that night, his team cancelled the entire remaining tour. There was no way to guarantee basic safety at public events in Germany anymore. Rudolf Steiner never gave another lecture in Munich. And the man whose movement had organized that night was just getting started. 6 months later, on the night of December 31st, 1922, the Goetheanum caught fire. And in November 1923, less than a year after that, Adolf Hitler and General Ludendorff attempted a coup inside the Bürgerbräukeller, a beer hall in Munich. The beer hall putsch failed. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers died. Hitler was arrested, wrote Mein Kampf in Landsberg prison, and came out 2 years later more dangerous and more determined than he'd gone in. When Steiner heard about the putsch, he formally closed his residence in Berlin, the city where he'd lived for 2 decades. He declared, without hesitation or dramatic flourish, if the people responsible for that ever came to power in Germany, it would no longer be possible for him to enter the country. That was 1923. Hitler came to power 10 years later. Steiner was right with a decade to spare, at a moment when most European intellectuals still treated Hitler as a loud, passing curiosity. And here is the detail that official history almost never emphasizes. None of the attacks stopped Steiner. Not one of them made him retreat, revise his position, or adopt a lower profile. Faced with all of this, the arson, the physical attacks, his growing exile from Germany, what he did was the opposite of what any reasonable person would have done. He accelerated. At Christmas 1923, less than a year after the Goetheanum fire and just weeks after Hitler's failed coup, Rudolf Steiner convened in Dornach what he called the Foundation, Conference of the New Anthroposophical Society. Members came from across Europe, from countries that had been at war with each other only 5 years earlier. For days he spoke, reorganized, refounded. Where there had been ashes, he built structure. Where there had been chaos, he made concrete plans. And after that, with his health already beginning to falter, his body visibly worn by 6 decades of relentless intensity, he entered the 14 most productive months of his life. Between Christmas 1923 and September 1924, Rudolf Steiner gave more than 300 lectures. There were days when he gave 3 or 4 different ones to different audiences, on completely distinct subjects: the Gospels in the morning, principles of medicine in the afternoon, cosmology or pedagogy at night. He traveled to England, the Netherlands, to the parts of Germany where he could still move freely. He led Waldorf teacher training courses in Torquay, England, in the summer of 1924, courses that would become the foundation of the first British Waldorf schools. He founded the School of Spiritual Science with sections for medicine, education, agriculture, the arts, astronomy, and mathematics. He sculpted in clay the scale model of the Second Goetheanum, this time in concrete, so that no fire could destroy it again. And in June of 1924, he traveled to Kobowitz in Silesia, where a group of farmers had called on him with a concrete concern: industrial agriculture, with its synthetic fertilizers, its pesticides, its exclusive focus on short-term yield, was destroying something they couldn't precisely name, but felt with growing certainty. The harvest still came, but the quality of the soil declined year after year. The animals got sick in new ways. The taste of the food was subtly changing. Something was wrong that the production numbers didn't capture. Steiner gave 8 lectures in Kobowitz, and what emerged from them was biodynamic agriculture, the first certified organic farming system in modern history. The central idea was at once simple and radical. A farm is not a factory, it is a living organism. The soil is not an inert substrate into which you inject chemical nutrients to extract production. It is an incomparably complex community of life, with billions of microorganisms, fungi, bacteria, and forces interacting in ways that 20th century chemistry couldn't measure. And this living organism responded not just to chemistry, but to cosmic rhythms, lunar cycles, seasonal patterns, influences that an attentive farmer could learn to work with instead of ignoring. There were specific preparations made from plants, minerals, and organic processes that could vitalize the forces of the soil in ways that synthetic fertilizers simply couldn't reach. At the time, most agronomists dismissed it as mysticism dressed in technical vocabulary. But the farmers who applied the principles saw results consistent enough that in 1928, 3 years after Steiner's death, the Demeter certification was founded, the first organic farming certification system in the world. Today, certified biodynamic farms operate in more than 50 countries. Some of the most acclaimed wines in Burgundy and California are produced according to principles Steiner articulated in 8 lectures at a Silesian estate in 1924, and researchers at the Research Institute of Organic Agriculture in Switzerland have published peer-reviewed studies showing that biodynamic soils sustain greater microbial diversity than conventionally farmed soils, or even simply organic ones. What looked like agricultural mysticism in the 1920s started finding measurable scientific correlations 100 years later. But while the farmers of Kobowitz were putting what they'd learned into practice, Steiner was already working in another territory that touched on even more powerful interests: medicine. There was a woman at his side in his final years who is impossible to leave out of Steiner's story without distorting it. Ita Wegman was born in the Netherlands in 1876, had trained as a physician in Zurich at a time when women doctors were still a rarity that many men in the profession preferred to dismiss, and had encountered Steiner around 1902. She became his closest intellectual and clinical collaborator, and it was with her that Steiner developed Through the early 1920s, a medical approach that proposed something the conventional medicine of the time simply refused to treat as a legitimate question. That a human being is not only a physical body. This wasn't a rejection of anatomy, pharmacology, or surgery. It was a proposal that healing someone requires attending to dimensions of human life that a laboratory test doesn't capture. That illness rarely happens only in the physical body, that it has roots in how a person lives, thinks, feels, relates to the world, and that therapies engaging those dimensions, music, painting, movement, working with one's own biography, can mobilize healing forces that medication alone cannot reach. In 1920, in Arlesheim, the first clinic based on these principles opened its doors. Physicians who combined conventional medical training with anthroposophical studies began to be trained. And in 1925, Steiner and Wegman published together Fundamentals of Therapy, a technical, rigorous book proposing not just new therapies, but a new understanding of the human being as an object of healing. For the pharmaceutical industry that was, in those exact years, consolidating its dominance over Western medical education, this was a concrete market threat, not a violent one, an intellectual one. And intellectual threats that can't be answered with arguments tend to be answered with institutional silence and systematic discrediting. But Steiner didn't stop to defend himself publicly. There was no time, because his body, which had sustained decades of unrelenting intensity, was sending signals that could no longer be ignored. In September 1924, Rudolf Steiner gave his last public lecture in Dornach. It wasn't announced as such. He probably didn't know it would be the last. But when he finished and withdrew to his studio, he didn't return to the podium. The people around him in that period described someone who had, finally, reached his physical limit. A pallor that rest couldn't fix. A weakness that deepened week by week. A man who seemed to be being consumed from the inside. He settled into his studio, the space where he drew, sculpted, wrote, and remained there for the last months of his life. He kept working on the autobiography he'd begun serializing in the Society's newspaper. He kept receiving visitors, dictating letters, but no longer standing in front of an audience. The official version says Rudolf Steiner died of exhaustion, and that version isn't a lie. There are concrete reasons to support it. Decades of work at an intensity that few human organisms sustain for that long. Years of organized persecution, the trauma of the Goetheanum fire, his growing exile from Germany, the complete refounding of the society after all of that, and then 300 lectures in 14 months, with his health already deteriorating. Any reasonable person looking at that picture would say, of course he died of exhaustion. He never stopped. But there is another version, and it has never been refuted. Among Steiner's closest followers, in the months immediately after his death, a question began circulating that no one wanted to ask out loud, but that no one could entirely dismiss. What if it wasn't just exhaustion? The symptoms Steiner had presented since the end of 1923 were specific in a way that drew attention. It wasn't the diffuse decline of someone simply burned out. It was a progressive gastrointestinal deterioration, pain, increasing digestive weakness, an inability to properly absorb nutrients, combined with a general deterioration that advanced even during periods of rest. The physicians who attended him, including Ita Wegman, never arrived at a clear diagnosis that fully explained the picture, and the timing disturbed those who were paying attention. The deterioration had deepened abruptly, right after the period of greatest violence in the organized persecution, the Munich attack, the Goetheanum fire, Hitler's putsch. Before that, Steiner had maintained a work rhythm his body had sustained for decades. After it, the decline was progressive and without real recovery. Steiner himself, according to direct testimony from people who were with him in his final months, had made references to external influences on his health. Not explicit accusations, oblique, careful references, the kind that could be interpreted more than one way. And he had asked, with the same clarity he brought to everything, that his followers not speculate about it publicly. Why ask that? Two possible interpretations. The first, he knew that accusations without proof would turn the movement into an object of ridicule and pull focus away from the real work. The second, and this is the one that can't be easily set aside, he knew something that public speculation would make more dangerous, not less. There is no document that proves poisoning. But here is what we know with certainty about the context. The groups that persecuted him were organized, funded, and capable of coordinating physical attacks in packed auditoriums. They had clear motive to want Steiner silenced permanently. And in the decades that followed, those same groups would demonstrate, on an industrial scale, that they had absolutely no problem with the convenient elimination of people who represented ideological threats. Rudolf Steiner died on March 30th, 1925, in the simple bed that had been set up in his studio because he could no longer walk to his bedroom. He was 64 years old. Ita Wegman was at his side. How he died remains an open question. What he left behind, that's where the story gets truly unsettling. Rudolf Steiner died in March of 1925. In November of 1935, 10 years later, Adolf Hitler's government formally banned the Anthroposophical Society in Germany. In March of 1936, the Reich's Minister of Education, Bernhard Rust, prohibited all private schools from accepting new students, a measure that sentenced the German Waldorf schools with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was destroying. One by one, the schools were forced to close. Teachers who resisted were barred from teaching. Some were arrested. The last Waldorf school in Nazi Germany held out until 1941, when it finally gave in. Steiner's books were added to the regime's lists of forbidden works. This was not a bureaucratic accident, not the overzealousness of mid-level officials. It was deliberate logic. The regime had read enough Steiner to understand that a pedagogical system that forms thinking, autonomous human beings, people capable of questioning authority and developing their own judgment, is, by definition, incompatible with any form of totalitarianism. It doesn't matter whether the class is trigonometry or eurythmy. What matters is how the class happens. And in Waldorf classrooms, children learn to observe before concluding, to question before accepting, to develop their own understanding of things before receiving the official version ready-made. For a state that needed obedience, that was dangerous. For a state that needed fanaticism, it was unacceptable. Here is the cruel irony that history records without mercy. The same regime that destroyed Steiner's schools, banned the society he built and burned his books. That regime collapsed in 1945 into ruins. Universal shame and definitive historical judgment. And the schools reopened. And the society continued, and the books went back on the shelves. But how far that legacy has grown goes well beyond what most people imagine. Today, more than a century after the founding of the first Waldorf school in that cigarette factory in Stuttgart, there are more than 200 Waldorf schools in 75 countries, and nearly 2,000 Waldorf kindergartens in 74 countries. It is the largest independent, non-religious school system in the world. From São Paulo to Nairobi, Tokyo to Portland, children are learning according to principles Rudolf Steiner developed in conversations with teachers in a German city shattered by war in 1919. Public education systems in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Scandinavian countries have adopted elements of Waldorf pedagogy, especially the emphasis on experiential learning and the integration of the arts, without necessarily using the name or acknowledging the origin. Biodynamic agriculture, dismissed as agrarian mysticism when Steiner proposed it in 1924, now moves billions of dollars a year through the global market for certified organic products. The Demeter brand, founded 3 years after his death, is recognized today in more than 50 countries. Biodynamic wineries rank among the most respected in the world. Producers of cheese, olive oil, vegetables, and grains sell their products at prices that reflect the value the market assigns to methods that the science of the 1920s had declared irrelevant. Anthroposophical medicine maintains hospitals and clinics in Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, Brazil, and other countries. Preparations developed from Steiner and Wegmann's ideas are being studied in modern clinical trials. Mistletoe extract, based on principles of anthroposophical pharmacology and developed under the commercial name Iscador by the company Weleda, which Steiner founded in 1921, is used as complementary therapy in cancer treatments at European clinics and is the subject of active scientific research at universities in multiple countries. Therapeutic communities for people with cognitive and physical disabilities, based on Steiner's principles and known as Camp Hill communities, exist in more than 20 countries. And the second Goetheanum, the one Steiner sculpted in clay in the weeks after the first one burned, the one he never lived to see built, was inaugurated in 1928. It still stands on that hillside above Dornach, looking out over the Swiss Alps. It is a concrete building that looks like nothing else in the world. Architects who visit describe the experience as disorienting. No banal angle, no repeated surface, no decorative element without function in the logic of the whole. A building that appears to have grown rather than been constructed. The most visible testament to a mind that refused categorization at every level, and that, because of that refusal, still provokes 100 years later. But there is a question this entire story hasn't answered yet, one that matters beyond Rudolf Steiner specifically. Why is someone who founded more than 1,000 schools, who created the world's first certified organic farming system, who left functioning hospitals and influenced artists, architects, doctors, and farmers on every continent, why is that person's story so little known? Why does the name Rudolf Steiner, when it surfaces, so often come with a slight dismissive smile? The answer lies in what the fire of 1923 couldn't destroy. And that's where we arrive now. Let's go back to that hillside above Dornach. January 1st, 1923, the sun has just come up. The ashes are still smoldering, Jakob Ott, the watchmaker who walked into the fire to save what he could, never came back out. 10 years of wood carved by the hands of volunteers from 14 countries lie on the ground, black and wet from the snow and the firefighters' hoses. And Rudolf Steiner is standing in front of all of it. He could have said it was a sign, that the opposition was too great, that it was time to stop. He was over 60, being targeted by organizations that would control entire countries within a decade. And the monument of a lifetime's work had just been reduced to ash in a single night. What he said was, "We'll build it again, this time in concrete." And he did. That choice, to continue, to rebuild, to accelerate even, is the heart of Rudolf Steiner's story. Not because it's miraculous or heroic in the action movie sense, but because it was consistent with everything he had thought and taught for decades. He had devoted his entire life to an idea that didn't depend on any specific building, any title, any institutional approval to be true. The idea that a human being is genuinely free, that this freedom is real, developable, practical, that it begins precisely when you stop accepting that you have only 5 senses, only 5 windows onto reality, only the perceptions that the dominant paradigm has decided are legitimate. 12 senses, 12 windows, and 7 of them systematically ignored by a paradigm that needed human beings to be smaller, more predictable, more controllable than they really are. That was a threatening idea in 1923 because it was threatening to any system that required obedience to function. It remains threatening today for the same reasons. In any era when the goal is to homogenize thought, to standardize education in service of pure economic productivity, to reduce the human being to its biological and neurological dimensions, Steiner's work is a provocation that doesn't age. And here is the most unsettling detail of all. Most of the people alive today who are in direct contact with Rudolf Steiner's legacy don't know it. The child attending a Waldorf school in São Paulo, Berlin, or Tokyo is participating in a pedagogical experiment that began with 256 children of cigarette factory workers in Stuttgart in 1919. The biodynamic winemaker, working his land according to lunar cycles, is applying principles Steiner laid out in 8 lectures at a Silesian estate in 1924. The doctor integrating art therapy into patient treatment at a European clinic is using ideas that Steiner and Ita Wegman systematized together. The architect designing buildings with organic forms and no right angles is in dialogue, consciously or not, with the vocabulary Steiner invented for a Swiss hillside in 1913. He is there, diffuse and anonymous, in the daily practices of millions of people who have never heard his name. He said he preferred it that way, that if he could change the name of anthroposophy to something different every day, he would, because what mattered wasn't the system, wasn't the name, wasn't the authority of the founder. It was the living activity of thinking in each human being who chose to think for themselves. It was the use of those 12 senses, all of them, not just the 5 the dominant paradigm granted permission to have. It was freedom, not as a philosophical concept, but as a daily practice by anyone who refuses to let others decide what is possible to perceive, to know, to be. That is probably exactly why he was fought so persistently, from so many directions at once. Not specifically what he taught, the practical consequences of people who actually did it. A school that raises children who question, A medicine that treats the sick person, not just the disease. A farm that respects the life in the soil. An architecture that treats form as a living language. A philosophical system that returns to the individual the authority over their own understanding of reality. All of that at the same time was, and remains, intolerable to any power that depends on people accepting that they are less than they are. The second Goetheanum still stands on that hillside in Dornach, a little strange, a little unclassifiable, impossible to fit into any known architectural category. Exactly like the man who designed it. Visitors come from all over the world. Some arrive knowing a great deal about Steiner. Many come out of architectural curiosity and leave with something that's hard to name but impossible to ignore. The feeling that a mind passed through here that tried something different and that something is still alive. What the fire of 1923 couldn't destroy, 10 years of Nazi prohibition couldn't destroy, and a century of institutional silence couldn't destroy. And it continues, not as a monument, as living practice, in classrooms, on farms, in clinics, in studios, in conversations happening right now in places Rudolf Steiner could never have imagined, among people who have never heard of him, but who use every single day tools he built. And that is, at bottom, exactly what he wanted. If this story stayed with you, if it touched something you'll keep thinking about after this video ends, you already know what to do with it. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Leave a comment below with what stayed in your head. And if you're not yet subscribed to the Unseen Key, do it now. Not because we want the number, but because every person who enters this conversation is one more memory that resists being erased. There are many stories like Rudolf Steiner's, stories of people who saw something that power needed to keep invisible, stories that time and neglect have almost erased. We are here to tell them while there is still time. What was burned on that hillside in Dornach in the early hours of January 1st, 1923, was not wood. It was the belief that ideas like these could be destroyed. And that belief, that one, was the only thing the fire actually consumed.